Okay, so hey everyone, my name is João Matos. Today I'll be talking about targeted learning and health equity. Brief introduction about me. I'm biomedical engineering master student at Europe. I was at MIT last semester, and I'm currently doing my thesis with Professor Jain, and at MIT with Laan. He's a doctor, but works with artificial intelligence as well. And the topics I'm doing research on are data bias, fairness, health equity, and in specific targeted learning and machine learning. So today I'll be sharing a bit about my research. Just to give you a short context on the laboratory I was in, so they are the guys who developed and maintain VCMI, which is a clinical data sharing platform. They also created Mimic and the eICU, which are like open, de-identified health clinical databases. And their missions are mainly driving clinical data sharing, democratizing their access, and also driving health equity research centered so that people can find disparities in data and do this kind of clinical research. So they basically decentralize medical knowledge. They organize datathons everywhere in the world every month. I was lucky to go to Toronto in February. That's the picture that's there. So as you can see, it's a very multidisciplinary, super diverse team. Also have the opportunity to go to some classes at MIT. This is a machine learning for healthcare class. And on the right, this picture is Pete Solowitz's house. He invited all the students to go to their house. It was super fun. So, as I said, I'll be talking about targeted learning. This was proposed by Max van der Laan in 2011 at Berkeley. And it's commonly known as targeted maximum likelihood estimation, also known as TMLE. So what is targeted learning? It's basically a mix of machine learning with causal inference. So instead of setting assumptions on the data and saying that the data is normally distributed, what they take is machine learning algorithms to model the data and model distribution so that you don't have to take these assumptions up front. And this is used in medicine, epidemiology, social sciences, but not as much as we would expect it to be. And I'll try to share a bit more about the methodology in this presentation. So as I was saying, TMLE is a semi-parametric framework. It includes machine learning to place minimal assumptions. So we have this picture here. What we do when we place assumptions is believing that everything is perfect, but in reality we have outliers, we have distributions that don't follow what we're expecting, so we probably need machine learning to do that estimation. And TMLE also provides us with valid statistical inference methodology, so it provides us with confidence intervals, p-values, errors, that we can take conclusions out of it. TMLE is doubly robust. What does this mean? It creates two models, one to model the outcome and another model to model the treatment. So as long as one of them is consistent, in the end we will have a consistent estimator. So if the sample size grows to very large, the bias will eventually converge to zero. Its output is an average treatment effect. This is the difference between the outcome if everyone had received the treatment versus no one received the treatment. So we have this toy example. Let's say that our outcome is myocardial infarction, and we have confounders that can be age, smoking status, and sex. And we want to assess the effect of a treatment that could be aspirin in this myocardial infarction. So an average treatment effect would give us the difference between the outcome for the ones that receive aspirin when adjusted for the same confounders versus the ones that don't receive the aspirin. This is a causal effect that we're trying to get, and TMLE can give us that as long as we require these three central assumptions. First one is also called the SUTVA. It's the stable unit treatment value assumption. Basically, it tells us that if someone receives a treatment, it will not affect other patients or other subjects. So each subject is independent from each other. The level of exposure or treatment is also the same for every individual. And these are basilar things that we cannot prove, but have to be reasoned by clinical expertise. The second assumption is that we cannot have unmeasured confounding. So we don't have residual confounding that we're not taking care of. If we are able to make sure that we're taking all the confounders into account, we can say that the outcome, the relationship between the exposure and the outcome is independent. We have a causal effect, and that would be causality. And finally, the positivity assumption. This means that everyone in our cohort is eligible to receive the treatment. So we have to have an example for every patient for the stratifications that we do, so that we have like a table with, let's say that we're looking at aspirin and we're comparing different sex and different outcome, getting myocardial infarction or not. We need to make sure that each cell of that table will be populated and that we have a positive example for that. And that's the only assumption that we can show. The other ones are shown by clinical expertise, shown or reasoned by. So if these are violated, we cannot try causal effects, but we can say something like the proportion of observations who experience the outcome after adjusting for baseline confounders verified, let's say 20% higher for those who receive the treatment versus the ones that didn't receive it. Okay, so what does the algorithm look like? If you have questions, feel free to interrupt. These are the 7 steps that I will guide you through very quickly. The first step is to estimate the outcome. Here we are using a logistic regression, but I'll get back to this further on. We can use super-learner algorithms, so more complex ensemble models to have a better modeling of the outcomes. But what is being done here is that we have a target, which is the outcome, in this case, myocardial infarction. We have a set of confounders, which were sex, age, and smoking status, and then we have a treatment, aspirin, yes or no. So we're comparing the ones who receive with the control or placebo, whatever we want. After estimating this model, we can predict the results, changing the treatment status to everyone receives the treatment or no one receives the treatment. And then we get these 2 vectors, vector number 2 and number 3, that are our predictions based on the initial model for the outcomes, if everyone receives the treatment and no one receives the treatment. And secondly, we create a second model that will be the likelihood of receiving the treatment. This is similar to inverse probability weighting. So we're basically doing propensity score matching so that we can have, we have a set of patients that are the same in all baseline covariates. They have the same age, the same race ethnicity, the same sex, the same comorbidities, but one receives the treatment, the other doesn't. So we have this kind of counterfactual modeling, and we do this with inverse probability weighting. And after getting these models, we will estimate the fluctuating parameter. So we will determine what's the difference between both, and this will be modeled as this epsilon that will be the only predictor in the end for our ATE. So step 1 was predicting initial outcomes. Step 2 was predicting the likelihood of receiving the treatment. And now there's some complicated maths, but basically what they're doing is optimizing the bias variance trade-off so that we can have the ATE that is consistent and confident for our problem. And as soon as we get this epsilon, the first and the second model, we can update the initial estimates for the expected outcome. And again, we do that for treated versus non-treated patients. And we get these 2 vectors that you can see here. And finally, we're in conditions to compute the ATE, which will be the difference between the ones that are not treated versus the ones that are treated. And in the end, we can say, hey, this treatment results in an increased 20% mortality or increased 20% of myocardial infarction. The good part of TMLE is also that it enables us to take statistical inference. So it allows to compute standard errors, and from there we can compute confidence intervals and p-values. And with this, we can take conclusions. We have a significant difference or not. As I said before, we can model the treatment and the outcome with more complicated models. What they use in TMLE, in specific in R, is this super learning package, which is basically an assembling of a lot of models. Basically, what they do is to try all the models that we say they should try. It could be a random forest, SVM, XGBoost, linear, non-linear models, whatever they want. We can input that to TMLE and say, please give me an ensemble model that weighs the best models after cross-validation on these distributions. And this is theoretically shown to yield better results because we're not setting assumptions a priori that the model should be linear or non-linear. And empirically, it also is resulting in better findings and better results. So bad news is that to use TMLE, we need to use R right now. So the package is originally developed by the Berkeley group in R. There's a newer package that they're developing again in R, and there's a couple of alternatives in Python, but they're not as validated, not as good. You can try them out. I haven't yet, but I had to learn R to use this kind of thing, and as a Python fan, I was not very happy about that. Do you have any questions about this part so far? We can have some space in the end for that too. Now I will guide you through a clinical use case that I've been working for in the last 6 months. We didn't publish this yet. We're still discussing some parts of it and adjusting some results. But the question is, does treatment effects of life-saving interventions across race ethnicity, so white versus non-white patients, when adjusted for illness severity, among patients with sepsis in the ICU, is it different? From this title, you can tell it's research based in America because they're very concerned about race ethnicity and all this racism question. So to give you a short background, sepsis is an extreme infection of the human body. It's very, it kills a lot of people. So 42% of people with sepsis will end up dying in the ICU. And even though this is a huge concern, there is limited evidence that the treatments that clinicians apply on these intensive care units are effectively life-saving or not. So it's based on assumptions or evidence that is not very strong. And for example, if you have a patient at 2 a.m. and you're tired, you're probably going to give them increased drugs or ventilate them so that you can rest assured that nothing's going to happen during the night. But during the day, the story is different. And so there are these differential and wide variability in treatments that can lead to outcomes. And this is the main hypothesis. So we wanted to investigate these inequalities in the likelihood of receiving the treatments, and also what's the effect of these treatments. Do they result in different mortality for different people? And so for that, we were looking at mechanical ventilation, renal replacement therapy, and vasopressors. The data that we used was MIMIC-4 and eICU-CRD. So MIMIC-4 stands for Medical Information Marks for Intensive Care. It's based in Boston, so it's from patients that come from Beth Israel Diagnostic Medical Center. Right now, it's in its 4th version, so it has data that's been captured throughout 10 years, and it has been hugely validated. A lot of people are using it. There's a lot of codes that is being open sourced, so people can validate each other codes, and it's a very productive database in terms of citations as well. And it contains, besides ICU data, it also has chest x-rays, notes, tabular data, ECG. Now they're adding echocardiograms, linking it with social determinants of health. It's getting more and more multimodal. eICU-CRD, on the other hand, stands for eICU Collaborative Research Database. It's also de-identified, but it comes from the whole US. So I think it's over 200 hospitals. It's also over 200,000 patients only during 2 years, so it's way, way bigger. It has similar data. It was created by the group as well, but the problem is that it comes from different hospitals, so the data is not as curated or validated as MIMIC, and there are a lot of uncertainties. Just so that we don't get lost in translation from now on, these are some definitions that I think it will be handy to know. So SOFA is the sequential organ failure assessment. It's a score between 0 and 24, and it represents illness severity. CCI is also known as Charlson Comorbidity Index. It basically tells if a person has a lot of comorbidities or past history. So the higher the value, the sicker the person is a priori. Then mechanical ventilation is an invasive ventilation, like the ones we had during COVID. So basically it involves intubation and the sedation of the patient, because we're basically placing a tube over the mouth. And tracheostomy is like a small hole that you can make here so that you can give oxygen to the patients. Renal replacement therapy is also known as dialysis. It's used when kidneys are failing. Vasopressors are drugs that increase blood pressure when the patients are very sick, especially in sepsis. They get very sick, very hepatic, so they basically give them vasopressors to increase the blood pressure. And then COPD and CKD are some comorbidities that we adjusted for. So, as I said, we used MIMIC 4 and the eICU-CRD. These are our inclusion and exclusion criteria. In the end, we got 57,000 patients. We're comparing non-whites versus whites, and we're looking at here, we're trying to check if we have some clear difference across race ethnicity before adjusting, before doing any kind of modeling. Can we see a big difference in the numbers that we have? We don't really see any big difference. So when you look at mortality, we have around 25% for both subgroups, and the trend is approximately the same for all the variables. So skipping some steps here, the statistical analysis that we did before starting TMLE, so we decided to set the outcome as in-hospital mortality. The treatments, as I said, mechanical ventilation, RT, and vasopressors. And then the confounders are these ones, so age, sex, race, ethnicity, Charlson Comorbidity Index, SOFA, key conditions that could be confounding the results of a certain treatment. For example, mechanical ventilation could be confounded by disease in the lungs or asthma, but for example, renal replacement therapy could be confounded by a chronic kidney disease, so we're adjusting for that too, and the two other invasive treatments that are not being studied. So we know that if a person is on mechanical ventilation, they're probably more likely to get vasopressors at the same time, so we need to adjust for that too. And then we're doing stratification by SOFA so that we can compare people with different illness severity versus, and also doing stratification by race ethnicity. So we want to look at white versus non-white people. These are the results that we got like in the end, and we're currently discussing them. So here, an ATE over 0 means that we have an increased mortality. So our outcome is the mortalities, which means that if we have, for example, in this example, 10% ATE means that 10% of the patients will die more when they get mechanically ventilated. As we go to the right, so we have SOFA range in the x-axis. As we go to the right, the patients are getting sicker and sicker. So our sample size is also decreasing. But the trend shows for mechanical ventilation and RT that as patients get sicker, the treatments become helpful, but if not, they're kind of harmful for the patients. We were looking for disparities across race ethnicity. We didn't find any apart from the ones in RT. So whites seem to be more harmed than black or non-white patients. Our hypothesis was the other way around. So these are some results that we have. And this is the discussion that we're driving right now. Our biggest problem is how to treat patients in the ICU with this information. Are we over-treating them? Are we driving an increased mortality when we think we were helping? And it's kind of hard to argue this. We're still looking for some kind of bug in the data that could be driving the wrong results. But this is a bit in line with the literature where less might be more. So if you treat the patients less in the ICU, you're probably helping them more than, so you probably shouldn't do anything. Also, it's a bit hard to say the treatments are overall not helping mortality. And this will probably be very rebated by the community, especially the medical community is very conservative in that sense. So it's a harsh statement to do, and we're trying to make sure it's not wrong. Just to share with you a bit the process of doing this. So the challenges are mainly curating the data. TMLE is just 5% of the job. We have a very good package. We just need to get the proper data frame with the outcome, the treatments, and the confounders. As soon as we get there, it's just one line of code. But getting there is the hardest part because we're talking about databases with a lot of tables, a lot of different names for the same thing. So we really need to work with the doctors in this process. And I was lucky to have a team of doctors to work with. And then we also need the clinical relevance to discuss these results. So do you have any questions about this? I'm just wrapping up with next steps. Okay. So we're doing these initial studies, but we already have some follow-up use cases that we want to explore and to leverage TMLE on. The first one is sepsis management. So same problem, but now comparing cancer versus non-cancer patients. The study design is very similar, but it's something that we're already studying. The other one is serum lactate prejudiced. So lactate is the strongest predictor for mortality in ICU. If a patient has a high lactate in day 1 and that lactate doesn't go down by day 2, they're probably going to die. And it's like super strong predictor because it basically reflects the dysfunction of the organs. Our hypothesis and our question is, do the same lactate values translate into the same treatments and translate into the same effect in mortality or length of stay? If we have the same lactate value but different people, will this change and will we have different effects? So this is something that TMLE can solve and that we're also exploring. And finally, this is another example that we are working with colleagues from the UK. Pulse oximetry has been shown to be biased against people of color. So there are falsely elevated values in oxygen saturation when you use the pulse oximetry. So when you compare the peripheral oxygen saturation with the ground truth value that comes from the blood, it's been shown to be like higher for people of color because it interferes with the infrared. And as such, it drives under treatment for these patients and results in increased mortality using causal inference methods and suggesting for the possible confounding. And this was a huge finding, I think like 2 years ago, or 1 year ago. And now we're very concerned about these devices. So FDA has already stopped regulating them. People are trying to do new devices. And what we're interested in is what's the downstream effects of such a device when you have a score like this one, the National Early Warning Score in the UK, which is basically a score that is applied in the whole UK to tell if the patient has to be seen by a doctor or not. And that score takes into account the values of SpO2. So if the value of SpO2 is under 90%, it means that the patient might be in hypoxia, and that will increase the score and increase the likelihood of being seen by a doctor. But if the value is over 90, the doctor will probably have a false reassuring sense that the patient is well when they're actually not. So what we want to see is, let's take the SpO2 as a treatment and see what's the effect in outcome of having this falsely elevated value when you're white and when you're not. And well, there are plenty other use cases that we can explore. So to wrap up, what's the impact of this and how can we actually apply this in a real world setting? So the first thing that we're exploring is this post-deployment clinical effectiveness dashboards. So as I said before, there's no clear evidence that the treatments that doctors decide to take are effective for a certain subpopulation. Clinical trials are mostly done on white populations, are centralized in rich countries, and are not necessarily going to generalize to low to middle income countries. So if I have with me a patient who's from a minority and I want to know if this treatment will be effective or not, how can I tell if it's not going to be harmful instead? So these dashboards would leverage TMLE to use past history data and say if this treatment will or not have negative effects on these subpopulations. And the other use case is also disparity dashboards in hospitals. So as of last week, the Biden administration said that health equity will be tied with funding for the hospitals. So hospitals that drive more health equity and report less disparities will be more likely to receive more funding. And this is a huge political shift that is happening right now, and it puts health equity in front and center of the research in hospitals and this kind of clinical research. And as such, these disparity dashboards would be something that would be able to tell you which hospitals are having more cases of disparities, like the ones that we can find in the study, where whites versus non-whites have very different effects of treatments. So these are some examples that we can have with this. Thank you. That's all from my part. And you can download the slides if you want, instead of like sending them by email. And yeah, happy to answer to your questions. Thank you.